Welcome to week 6 of On Pilgrimage with Luke. I'm your tour guide, Ray Crafton. In our search for what makes the narrative of Luke unique, our next stop will take us to the shores of the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus will call his first disciples. So let's pause here and give you a chance to read Luke chapter 5, verses 1 to 11. In his narration of this episode, Luke has joined together two stories. One of them is Mark chapter 1, verses 16 to 20. In Mark, this is the calling of the first disciples, and it's the basic inspiration for Luke's narrative. Remember that Luke, like Matthew, used Mark as a source. However, Luke has commingled this with a post-resurrection story that he's taken and transported to an earlier point in time when Jesus is still alive in the flesh and at the beginning, near the beginning of his ministry. You might want to pause here and go read Mark's account, but in any event, I've given you a summary here on the slide. In Mark, we're looking at the call of the first disciples. The people being called are Simon and his brother Andrew, and another pair of brothers, James and John, the sons of Zebedee. We're told in Mark that all four men are fishermen, were with Jesus on the shores of Galilee, and he calls them to follow him. By the way, we're also at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. Jesus calls them to follow him, saying, "I will make you fishers of men." Now, Luke's narrative pretty much follows Mark, except that he makes a few edits. Andrew and Zebedee are omitted in Luke's version, and Luke places this call of the first disciples well after Jesus' ministry has begun. That makes more sense, because in Mark, Jesus calls these people to follow him, and he's done nothing yet. Luke, on the other hand, has tried to rationalize this timeline and has already shown Jesus with an active ministry in Galilee, healing and preaching, and then he calls people. So that does make more sense. The other edit that Luke has made is, as Fitzmyer says, what a fisherman does to a fish is not salutary. In other words, it's not good for the fish. So when Mark says, "I will make you fishers of men," Luke has read that and said, that's a little off color. And so Luke uses a different term. He changes that and says, "You will be live catching men." And he takes the Greek words zoos and agrain and forms the word zogron, which means to live catch someone or something. So it's not at all far-fetched here to think of this in terms of live catching. This is part of a catch and release program. You catch people here and then release them into the kingdom of heaven. Now, besides the basic story from Mark and Luke's redactions to it to make it, to improve it, let's say, there is this curious commingling of a post-resurrection story. Why do we think this story is originally a post-resurrection story? Well, the things that are in Luke's narrative that tip us off to that are, first of all, in verse 5, Simon already calls Jesus Master, and yet he's never met this guy before. Secondly, in verse 8, Simon shows this deep remorse, which is unexplained. It's a non sequitur. Where does it come from? It makes no sense. So Simon's got this deep remorse, and in that verse 8, he refers to Jesus as Lord, which again is a post-resurrection term in many cases. Third, Jesus' response to him, "Fear not," is a phrase that's again associated with post-resurrection appearances. When Jesus shows up and people are nonplussed by it, the first words out of his mouth are often fear not. It may also be peace to you, but in some cases, many cases, it's fear not. The fourth bit of evidence here about this being a post-resurrection story that Luke has mixed in is that the John 21, the final chapter of the fourth gospel, has a very similar story to this one, and it is set as a post-resurrection story. And you may remember it. It's one in which a subset of the apostles are out in a boat fishing, and they catch nothing, and suddenly the risen Christ is there on the beach. And he calls to them and says, "Put down your nets on the other side." And in John's gospel, we now have 7 disciples. He's taken the 4 that are in, he's taken the 3 that are in Luke's narrative, and he's added 4 more to them to get the complete number of 7. And in John's telling of this episode, the net is not broken, as opposed to in Luke here, where it is breaking. And John tells us that there are precisely 153 fish. Now, I theorized when we were studying the Gospel of John that this is an image for the early church, and that what John is coding into this is there are at that time 153 large congregations, things that will eventually become dioceses. And John's metaphor for the net not being broken is that the church is held together in all of its diversity and geographical propagation. It's held together by Jesus as the net. But that has to do with John's telling and John's meaning for the story in the fourth gospel. Let's come back to Luke's narrative. What is Luke's message? Why does he have this story, and why does he commingle it with a post-resurrection account? Here we are on the one hand with near the beginning of Jesus' ministry, the call of the first disciples, and yet we've got this mixing and commingling of a post-resurrection story. As usual, I recommend that you pause here and think this over for yourself. And then I'll give you what I think this has, what I think is behind this. My idea is that what Luke has done here is set up a temporal wormhole. He's set up a connection in time between the calling of the first disciples in the period of Jesus and the calling of disciples in the period of the church in Luke's own day and time. Luke, in a sense, is saying, as it was then, so it is now. Like Simon, once you recognize Jesus as Master, once you confess Jesus as Lord, and Jesus has said to you, "Fear not," then the next thing to do is to follow him. And the punchline comes at the very end of the episode. And having left behind everything, they followed him. So the call to followers now is the same as it was to the first followers then. It is to leave behind the old way of living and to follow. Jesus' path will now take him away from the Sea of Galilee and up a mountain, where he will pray during the night, and in the morning will name 12 of his disciples as his apostles. Our path, on the other hand, will be to rendezvous with him as he comes down from the mountain, to what Luke says is a level place, and there we will listen to him deliver his Beatitudes. So if you will pause here and read Luke chapter 6, verses 17 to 26, we will then take up what makes Jesus' preaching of the Beatitudes in Luke's narrative so unique. The center column on this chart comes from the passage you just read. It's the portion of Luke's Sermon on the Plain in which Jesus utters the Beatitudes. In the left column, for comparison, is Matthew chapter 5, and this is Matthew's rendition of Jesus' delivery of the Beatitudes during the Sermon on the Mount. The unshaded portion of these two columns that Matthew and Luke have in common is thought to have come from the Q source that they are theorized to have shared. But notice in the two columns the text that's highlighted in gray. Both evangelists have added unique material to the Q material that they've inherited. Luke's edition are the Woes, and notice how these match one for one with the Beatitudes. These are color-coded to help illustrate that. Up top in blue you have blessed are the poor. Down below in blue, but woe to the rich. Up top in green, blessed are the hungry. Down below in green, woe to you who are full. Up top in what I think is orange, blessed are those who weep, for you will laugh. Down below in orange, woe to you who are laughing, for you will mourn and weep. Finally, in red, blessed are you when people hate, revile, and so on. Down below in red, woe to you when all speak well of you. In the left column in gray, Matthew has also added material to what he inherited from Q. Ignoring for a moment the four outright additions of Beatitudes, look at how Matthew phrases blessed are the poor. It's blessed are the poor in spirit, whereas Luke has blessed are the poor. In Matthew, you have blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. But in Luke, he's talking about blessed are the hungry. There's even some difference in Matthew and Luke's orange theme or orange material. Matthew talks about blessed are those who mourn, for they'll be comforted, which gives it a feel of a psychological or a spiritual thing that's going on here. It is, by the way, the same Greek that would be used for mourning one's sins. Whereas in Luke, it's about physical activity. Blessed are the people who are weeping because they're going to laugh. So it's not in somebody's head or somebody's heart. It's in their body. It's a physical condition. And now notice in the four Beatitudes that Matthew has added, blessed are the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, those persecuted for righteousness' sake. Those have a lot to do with behavior. Something else I would point out that makes Luke's rendition of the Beatitudes a lot sharper and more direct is notice he's dealing with the second person pronoun. Blessed are you, blessed are you, blessed are you, over and over again. Matthew is a bit more theoretical. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn. He's talking about third persons. Only when he gets down to the red material at the end does he shift over and use the second person, blessed are you. What I would say is the fundamental difference in feel between Matthew and Luke's versions is that Matthew talks about behaviors that are blessed. When people show these behaviors, they're blessed. Luke, on the other hand, talks about people who have a condition. They're blessed because of their condition, not because of their behavior. Now, for Matthew's rendition to be talking about blessings on behavior, remember that a big major theme in Matthew is the fulfillment of righteousness. So of course, he's going to have his Beatitudes phrased this way. But I'd like you to be thinking about not so much Matthew, but about Luke. Why is Luke talking about not behaviors, but conditions? Why is he being so physical It's the conditions of poverty and hunger and discrimination. People in those conditions are blessed in Luke's rendition. Finally, I ask you to notice the difference in the way Jesus refers to himself in these two different versions. In Matthew's version, look down at verse 11, where Jesus talks about, blessed are you when people revile you, evil again, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. If you compare that to Luke's 22nd verse, blessed are you when people hate you, exclude, revile, etc., on account of the Son of Man. So there's a difference in the way Jesus refers to himself. And that's worth thinking about in the discussion or thought question that I have for you here. So before going on to the next slide, I've talked about the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes there fitting in with Matthew's theme of fulfillment of righteousness. But we're on Luke. So what themes in Luke's narrative do his version of the Beatitudes and Woes support? So you might want to pause here and think that over. Think back to all of the different themes we've talked about that are big deals in Luke and see what you come up with. And then go to the next slide and I'll give you my thoughts. For me, Luke's version of the Beatitudes and Woes brings to mind the following themes. The first one is that heaven's priorities lie with freeing the physically disadvantaged, accent on freedom and physical. We're not talking about the poor in spirit. We're talking about the poor. We're not talking about those hungering for righteousness, but the hungry. We're not talking about those who are in need of some sort of psychological or spiritual comforting or emotional comforting. We're talking about people whose sorrow has become a physical thing. They are weeping, and that's to be replaced by a physical thing of laughter. Now, we've heard this before when we journeyed to the synagogue in Nazareth with Jesus, and we listened to him read from the text of the prophet Isaiah. He read, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And notice how physical those things are. It's the poor. It's release for captives. It's sight for the blind, and to let the oppressed go free. And as he said then, these things are fulfilled today, not at some time in the future, not at the end of time, today. And in a passage that we did not read because it's shared by Luke with both Matthew and Mark, Jesus commented in Luke chapter 5, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick." Again, very physical orientation. The second theme that comes to my mind is derived from the first concerning heaven's priorities, and that is heaven's priorities are going to lead to the great reversal. The dawn of salvation brings with it a leveling of human society. Today's underprivileged stand to gain in the kingdom of heaven. Today's privileged stand to lose perquisites. At least I like to think that that's all they're losing, although the language of Luke is much harsher than that. Perhaps I think that way simply because I stand more in the privileged class than I do in the underprivileged. And we've heard this theme before too. If you think back to the infancy narratives and Mary's Magnificat, where in her canticle she says, "He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly." He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich empty away. A third theme that speaks to me in this passage from Luke is Jesus is in solidarity with all of humanity. And we saw this for the first time at the Nativity with the images and symbols of the swaddling cloths and the birth taking place not in an inn. And so here in the Beatitudes, this theme recurs in the form of Jesus referring to himself as the Son of Man, the son of Adam, like all of us who are either sons or daughters of Adam. This man is one of us. And something that would be easy to overlook is the placement of this story in Luke, the physical placement. Matthew's Beatitudes are part of the Sermon on the Mount. Mountaintops are the places where laws are given. Think back to Moses at Sinai, for instance. But in Luke, Jesus delivers the Beatitudes at a level place. He's come down from the mountain. He's on our level. He's joined us down here below. And if you will, he speaks to us on the level. This is our guy, the Son of Man, talking to us on the level. The fourth theme that I think about here is, again, the universality of salvation, that it's for all people. And to me, this is contained in the fourth Beatitude, the one that was in the red text on the previous slide. Note that in Luke, and it's true in Matthew as well, but note that in that fourth Beatitude, there's a you versus they kind of thing going on. And so let's ask, who is you? Who is they? Those who are addressed as you in Luke's telling of the story, those people are disciples and others, and they come from both Jewish and Gentile territory. Luke tells us that they're from Judea, and they're also from Tyre and Sidon, which is Gentile territory in Phoenicia. It's territory that abuts Syria. It's outside of Judea. So the you are people who are following Jesus, people who need him and who are learning from him, following him. And they're both Jew and Gentile. The they, on the other hand, the ones doing the reviling and the hating, the they, we're told in that Beatitude, well, their ancestors are the people who persecuted the true prophets of Israel. So the they are, in fact, the Jewish authorities that are opposing those who follow Jesus because they're not following the law. They're not electing to become full-fledged Jews. They're doing this one-off thing in following the rabbi from Nazareth. And on an upcoming slide, I'll once again show you how Jesus' words in that fourth Beatitude echo those of his mother in her Magnificat. I mentioned Mary's Magnificat on the last slide, but take a look on this one at just how closely Jesus' Beatitudes and Woes reflect what Mary said in the Magnificat. This really is a case of like mother, like son. And you can see as you compare the color coding here that except for the Beatitude that says, "Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh." This is a tit for tat kind of a thing, back and forth between Jesus' Sermon on the Plain and Mary's Magnificat. They're very close to one another. The fourth Beatitude, the one shown in red here that seems to be dealing with universal salvation, has its mirror image back in what Mary said when she talked about God's mercy being on anyone who fears God from generation to generation. And that remember also that the figure of Abraham, whom she mentions, and his descendants forever, that in Luke, Abraham is the patriarchal figure of universal salvation. So mother and son in Luke are quite similar in the way they think about God and God's activity in the world. One of the other threads that I wanted to follow up on out of Luke's Beatitudes was that spot where Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. Now, the New Testament confers many different titles on Jesus, and I haven't captured every single one of them on this slide, but I've tried to capture the most frequent ones. And these titles show up either because a narrator uses the title and applies it to Jesus, or in recounting a story where Jesus interacts with somebody, that somebody addresses Jesus with one of these titles. And finally, the third case would be where Jesus refers to himself by one of these titles. The left-hand table shows references to Jesus by others, either narrators or somebody speaking about him or to him. And what we find there is that for the most part, the titles used are one of three: Lord, Teacher, or Rabbi. In the Gospel of Luke, those three titles are particularly concentrated. They make up almost 3/4 of all the references to Jesus by another person. And you probably recall that Luke tends to stay away from Jewish terminology, and so that's why you see him only using Greek words for teacher and never using the word rabbi. Notice, however, in the other three canonical Gospels, you do get a mixture of teacher and rabbi, both being used. The right-hand column in that table of references by others is that column captures all of the other writings in the New Testament that are not Gospels. And in the epistles and in Acts, the titles, it just boils down to two titles that tend to dominate the landscape, and the two are Christ and Lord, and they're used about equally. Oh, I should also note that recall that in Luke, followers of Jesus tend to address him as Lord. Non-followers tend to address him as teacher. When we move to the right-hand table where Jesus refers to himself by a title, we see a very different pattern. It's dominated by Son of Man. This pattern is so dominant that it's led scholars to believe that this was Jesus' favorite term for referring to himself. And certainly within Luke, it's Luke's favorite term of self-reference for Jesus. And it, again, fits with one of Luke's themes about Jesus' humanity and his solidarity with humanity. The reason, by the way, that the other column doesn't show up in that right-hand table is that there are no self-references of Jesus outside of the Gospels, so you don't find those in epistles or in Acts. I hope it's become evident by this point that in Luke, the Jesus event breaks into human history with a salvation that's not only enduring and universal, but at its root, it's based on radical freedom. Freedom from want, from illness, from oppression, just as Jesus said when he read from the prophet Isaiah in the synagogue in Nazareth. Freedom from anything that holds a human being back from becoming all that they can be. And what Luke has seen with great clarity is that if this salvation of freedom is to be truly enduring and universal, it entails that society's inequalities be leveled and that physical possessions be treated differently. Social ethics have to be based on distribution and not on accumulation. Recall what John the Baptist said. This is preaching that Jesus heard early in Luke. John the Baptist told the crowds, if you have two coats and you see someone who has none, give him one. Do the same with food. Bear the fruit that befits repentance, fruit which gives, does not take. And we've heard speeches several times now in Luke from both Jesus and his mother about the great reversal, about the replacement of accumulation with distribution. Luke is so expressive of these ideas that it might be assumed that he's the originator of them. But in fact, Luke has come by these from his study of Hebrew sacred writings. He's looked at Judaism's scriptures, and it's just amazing to me that a Gentile is cut to the heart of the social ethics of Judaism. So where do these ideas come from? Well, we have to go clear back to Moses and the burning bush. At the burning bush, Moses has an encounter with being itself, the totality of existence. When he asks what to call this thing that he's met, the entity says, I am who I am. I am the existing one. And so in Hebrew, that becomes Yahweh, I am. And this entity, this fundamental existence, has a message that Moses is to convey to Pharaoh. And the message is, free the people that they may become. Existence says to Moses, I'm claiming these people for mine, not Pharaoh's. They belong to existence. I have ideas, says Yahweh, about what they will become. And so Yahweh keeps Yahweh's part of the bargain and sets the chosen people free, leads them out into the desert, and there they begin to be formed by Yahweh into a people through whom salvation will come to the entire world. But there is a contract here, a thing called a covenant. Yahweh says, I'm going to cut a covenant with you. This is what I've done for you. This is now what you will do for me. You will follow my laws. Now, some of these laws are rather peculiar to us today because they have to do with helping the people form an identity, a separateness from the cultures around them. But embedded in this contract are clauses about righteous society. And if you boil these down to a single phrase, that single phrase would be, pay it forward. In other words, Yahweh says, I have freed you. Now you must free others. Pay it forward. And some of the most outstanding clauses of that kind in the contract are found in Leviticus 19. And I'm going to read you a few of these in a minute. But at the end of each clause, since this is a very long, involved contract, at the end of each clause, Yahweh essentially initials that clause. Think about a modern contract that's rather long and involved that you may have been a signatory to lately. If it was long and involved, you probably had to initial parts of it before you got to the end and signed it at the bottom. So this is going to happen in Leviticus 19, where Yahweh is going to sign off on each and every clause. So beginning in verse 9 of Leviticus 19, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. Signed, Yahweh, the Lord your God. Skipping down a little bit in the contract, you shall not defraud your neighbor. You shall not steal, and you shall not keep for yourself the wages of a laborer until morning. You shall not revile the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. Signed, Yahweh the Lord. Skipping down a little further in the contract, you shall rise before the aged and defer to the old, and you shall fear your God. Signed, Yahweh the Lord. When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself. Here is the punchline. For you were aliens in the land of Egypt. Signed, Yahweh, the Lord your God. In other words, pay it forward. At the bottom of this slide, I've given you a rather long link to what's actually a very short essay. It's an essay that's only 4 paragraphs long, written by Professor David Plines. Professor Plines teaches religious studies at Santa Clara University, and he's the author of a book entitled The Social Visions of the Hebrew Bible. I will read you a couple of bits from his very short essay. He writes, "The biblical vision for justice came to hinge on the belief that God had acted in history to liberate the people of Israel from bondage as slaves in Egypt. God's victory over Pharaoh was sealed by a treaty, a covenant, in which the people of Israel were bound to sacred obligations and laws. Among these were laws regulating care for the poor, the day laborer, and the foreign immigrant. The treatment of the neighbor, in other words, became a sacred obligation." In other words, it's that thing I was saying earlier about Yahweh frees the chosen people and they're to pay it forward. A little later in the essay, Professor Plines observes that the ancient Israelites were in part influenced by the legal practices of their world, where law codes were commonly issued by kings. I would comment and add to that often those law codes reflected the character of the king. For instance, the Code of Hammurabi in Babylon. At the time that the social ethics of the Hebrew nation were set down, there was no king. The kings came later in their history. So at the time there was no king other than Yahweh. And so to them, their law code reflected their leader, who was Yahweh. And as Professor Plines goes on to observe, failure to treat the poor justly became the telltale sign of an unjust society. It meant a break in the covenant, in the contract, a break in the relationship between the chosen people and Yahweh. My closing thought about this slide is that I observe that in our own day, some 2,000 years after Luke captured what were already ancient ideas in his narrative, we're still struggling to enact these social ethics. To enact these social ethics is neither left nor right, neither liberal nor conservative, neither Republican nor Democratic. To enact these social ethics is holy and righteous. They are the demand of existence itself. And so our words and actions now must always be the same as those of Moses before Pharaoh. Free the people that they may become. Well, thanks for joining us for this installment of On Pilgrimage with Luke. I think we'll end today's session here at this point, keeping it deliberately short so that our Sunday sessions can catch up with where we are on YouTube. We tend to run behind the YouTube installments due to in-class discussions. So please join us next week when we will journey with Jesus and Luke to the Galilean town of Nain. And there we will observe Jesus at the height of his powers that exceed those of even the greatest Old Testament miracle workers, Elijah and Elisha. Have a good week and see you then.